Aloha. I'm Representative Barbara Marumoto, and I represent the 19th House District, which includes Kaimuki and Kahala. And I have about half of Kahala and Kahala Beach. And so I have two guests today that are willing to talk to me about Kahala and the beach area. And they are, first of all, Lucinda Piles, who is a resident of the Kahala Beach area. Also, you've been a past member of the Waialae Kahala Neighborhood Board number 3.
Right. Yes, I have.
And on my right is Dolan Eversole, and he is a coastal geologist with the UH Sea Grant College, quite an expert on coastal areas. He is on loan and a consultant to the Department of Land and Natural Resources Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands. And today we're going to start off talking about Kahala Beach and the fact that, well, I call it an incredibly shrinking beach. We'll be showing some photographs, and I'll have my guests describe what they're seeing. So without further ado, maybe you could describe the problem we have with this beach.
Well, I've lived in Kahala for almost 40 years and raised 3 sons, spent many hours up and down the beach. And I know several years ago I began to think, gee, we're getting a lot of erosion on this beach. And then I had occasion to pull out some old photographs and was surprised to see that in fact what was really happening was the vegetation was advancing seaward. It wasn't that the beach was shrinking because we were losing sand, but because of encroaching vegetation. So have gotten very interested in that issue, and we at high tide along much of the beach have no lateral access, no recreational use, and concerned that the natural processes of the beach are being interfered with.
Could I interrupt you just for a second? I just would like to explain that there's a portion of the beach that is owned by the state, really should be available to public access, and perhaps I could get you to explain just what part of the beach is state property.
Okay, that's a good question. Thank you. The state ownership of beach is a very nebulous question, and what I can talk about today, though, is public access. And public access is defined by state statute to the upper reach of the wash of the waves. And that's generally interpreted to mean the highest wash of the highest wave. So by our own state statute, the public is entitled to access up to the shoreline, to the upper reaches of the wash of the waves, regardless of ownership. So this would apply to private property that's being submerged by these waves, or by state-owned land, or doesn't matter who owns it. So in this case, the ownership issue is, regardless of who owns it, public has the right to access up to the shoreline. That presents an interesting problem for a site like Kahala, where you have vegetation that is now growing well seaward of that upper reach of the wash of the waves, and thus interfering with public access. So clearly that's generated a tremendous amount of interest and concern by government agencies as well as the community in Kahala to try to restore that lateral public access. So that's one distinction I would make for the viewers out there, is the distinction between public access to the shoreline, which also has its own ordinances and statutes related to that, and access along the shoreline laterally, which has a separate set of statutes that define what can and can't be done there.
So public access is what we really are looking for, and this is what the people would like to enjoy, the benefits of the beach. So
that's correct.
Thank you for straightening me out on that one.
Sure. One thing I can say, we've done quite a bit of research on this issue, and it turns out Hawaii is probably the most conservative state in the nation as far as public access goes. And the ability for people to have a state statute here in Hawaii that requires or allows public access up to a very liberal amount of beach area. And actually one of the intents of that statute is to dedicate as much access as possible to the public. You can contrast that with some other states, coastal states in the nation, that are quite different, and they actually allow public or private ownership of the beach itself and restrict any public access across the beach down to the low water mark.
Okay.
So
we have a public access problem, which is a statewide concern and not just Kahala.
that's right.
Okay. Well, perhaps you could fill us in a little bit on Kahala Beach and the history. And you were saying you lived there for a long time. And
Well, it's an interesting history. Apparently, under Bishop Estate, there was a very high regard and respect for the shoreline ecosystem. And Bishop Estate leases, which were still the way you owned land back when we moved into Kahala in the early 70s, didn't allow any form of development, fencing, planting, pools, anything within about 40 to 50 feet of the shoreline.
we do have some older photographs that we could show.
There was, they called it the Beach Reserve, and it actually had a separate tax key map and ran as a ribbon along the frontage of all the properties. So there are some pictures. Actually, there's one of myself pregnant in 1976, and that son who I was pregnant with in the picture on the screen is now 34 years old. And if you look closely, you'll see no fences, no naupaka, and no how trees. And that shelf there actually comes and goes, still does today. Sometimes the sand is right up even with the grass. Other times it's not. But there wasn't the fortress building that we see today along the beach, and the masses of saltwater tolerant vegetation that is planted and then migrates seaward, sometimes 15 to 20 feet onto the public resource portion of the beach.
Now we have a problem with people planting vegetation and sort of encouraging its growth toward the high water mark.
We do. I think what we're seeing is a trend, and under Bishop Estate you might say that the preservation and protection of the beach was the highest goal. Maybe today we have a private versus public issue. Maybe we have a resident versus non-resident issue. But how properties are fenced and how they are isolated seems to be contributing. And I think people put up a fence and then they plant, and they of course irrigate those plants so that they grow, and then they forget them. And those saltwater tolerant naupaka and how plants, once they're rooted, the ocean, the tide waters them, so they just keep marching seaward.
But I've seen some irrigation pipes on the Mackay side of fences that are inducing the growth of vegetation.
Very much so. I have many, many photographs up and down the beach where those plants, the one on the screen right now shows a fence and naupaka that was planted, Mackay of the fence, and an irrigation line that was there. Now that the naupaka is fairly clearly well established, then they may cap the line. So if the city or the state comes out and says, hey, you're irrigating that, they go, oh no, that's capped, we're not. And sometimes the property changes hands. The person who actually planted and induced the naupaka may no longer be the current owner and may legitimately say, I didn't plant